All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining in. Chodesh Tov. We are, of course, entering the second Adar tonight and getting ready for Purim. We'll have a couple of things to say about Purim, although we'll concentrate more on that in a couple of weeks ahead. I'm just back last night from Dubai. It's quite a remarkable place. I'm not going to speak too long about it, but it is very fascinating to go to an Arab country where you really feel completely at home, in the sense that I think you can wear an I Love Israel t-shirt in Dubai and you'll get no negative comments. You might even get a couple of high fives and waves. And that's pretty much unheard of in at least the last 100 years in any Arab country. And what they've done there is nothing short of remarkable. It basically has risen from a very backward fishing, quote unquote, village to 4 million people living in Dubai. And it's built up, it's kind of Manhattan times 100, maybe Shanghai times 10. It's just absolutely mind-blowing how they have built up this country of this community. It's one of course, of the 7 emirates that make up the Gulf states, the UAE, and they have a very warm and I think genuine relationship with not only the Jewish people who are living there. There's about 500 people, 500 Jews who live there full time. A lot of people coming through on business, on tourism, and they also have a very seemingly sincere, tolerant, and friendly relationship with Israel. And we have not seen that pretty much anywhere before. We have peace treaties with Egypt and with Jordan, but they are at best a cold peace. But the Emirates are actually very warm towards Israel. And you don't really, I'm going to have to mute them, I'm sorry. You don't really certainly experience any antagonism. It's also unique in that there's essentially no crime in the Emirates because 84% of the people there are non-citizens. Only 16% of the Emirates are actually citizens, and they don't easily allow someone to become a citizen of the Emirates. So most of the people there are foreign workers or expats who have come to work and tourists. And, they generally, these are not people that make trouble. If the foreign workers make any kind of problems at all, they're just sent packing immediately. This is not a democracy. This is a country that is owned by families, by the sheiks and their families. And they've created a very benevolent society, it seems. No income tax, no corporate tax, health paid for, schools paid for. So the standard of living is very, very high, at least among the citizens. And therefore, it's really kind of a fascinating place to visit. And I'm not a promoter for going to Dubai, but it's relatively close to Israel. And I think really from start to finish, we're treated very, very respectfully and very nicely. And we heard from representatives of the Jewish community there, including Dr. Eli Abadi, who's a very fascinating individual, as Smicha from YU. He is a medical doctor and was a very successful rabbi in Manhattan and has decided to come and essentially become the leading Jewish figure in the Emirates. And he spoke to us and told us that he's absolutely convinced that they are sincere in their desire to come to normalize with Israel. And basically, they don't want any enemies, including Israel. And we're happy to hear that because we're always the exception to the rule about countries that say, well, anybody can come here except Israelis. We'll have relationships with any country except Israel. And they've broken that mold. And they've done it at great risk to themselves because they're not a don't have an advanced military. They have an army, but compared to some of the countries that surround them, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, they have much greater, larger, more powerful armies. They're willing to buck the trend and say, we'll make peace with Israel and do business with Israel and no restrictions whatsoever. And as I say, you can wave an Israeli flag and nobody's going to say boo to you. If anything, you might get some, as I said, some applause from here and there. In any case, I don't want to dwell on that issue, only maybe we'll bring it up later, only to say that, we live in an age of miracles, and you could not have predicted this 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, that this kind of situation would exist. And now that Jared Kushner and his partner are up for a Nobel Prize, I think that certainly President Trump should be up for a Nobel Prize. It's just an amazing achievement that is kind of changing the face of the Middle East to some extent, and hopefully will have an effect on other countries. We'll see. But we're going to talk tonight about a couple of other different issues. First of all, we're coming to the end of Sefer Shemot, which ends in the double parsha Vayakel Pekudei, being that this is a leap year. So we are reading only Pekudei this week. But essentially, there's sister parshiot that talk primarily about the Mishkan. And the question we can start out asking is, why do we end? Sefer Bereshit is such a tumultuous and dramatic sefer that really centers around Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus, and the Ten Commandments. I mean, this is just filled with amazing narratives. But the Torah chooses to end talking about the Mishkan. Why is that? Why are we repeating, in effect, things that we learned before? When you go through Vayakel Pekudei, it's immediately obvious to you, we have been here before. This is deja vu. And yet we're doing it. And we're talking about all the objects in the Mishkan. We're talking about the construction, about the nuts and bolts. Some of it is far from being all that interesting. And yet we've chosen to make this the closing topic. So I want to say, first of all, I saw that Shlomo Katz has a beautiful idea. He says that the Torah is like a love letter. When you get a love letter, you don't just read it once, you read it over and over. And that is certainly true about the Torah. When people ask, well, gee, didn't we read these parshiot last year and the year before and the year before? Okay, but it's kind of God's love letter to us. And so we read it over and over. And that's true about the Torah in general. But why, we can ask, are we focusing so much on this one subject of the Mishkan? So the Sforno gives a very interesting approach to this idea. And the Sforno says that as maybe unusual or as strange as it may sound, the Mishkan was actually more holy than the Beit HaMikdash. We are always focused on the Beit HaMikdash, and rightfully so, but the Sforno says it doesn't really compare to the Mishkan. The Mishkan had a deeper holiness to it. And part of it is derived from the fact that in this very first pasuk, it says, Eila Pekudei HaMishkan, Mishkan Ha'edut. But what you're seeing is, when you read it without any punctuation, the word Mishkan is repeated. So we say Mishkan, Mishkan. Do you remember when we talked about this and when we said that when you repeat a name in the Torah, it's indicating something very special when it refers to a human being? And we saw this by Noach. Eila Toldot Noach, Noach Ish Tzaddik. So there you have Noach, Noach. You have Abraham, Abraham in a place. You have Yaakov, Yaakov. You have Moshe, Moshe. Right? We know Abraham, Abraham by the Akedah that Hashem calls him. He says, Abraham, Abraham, right there. It's very clear. But anytime you have a name repeated, so the rabbis explained, and if you remember, we learned this before, that there are two, how shall I put it? There are two versions of you. There is you as you exist, and there is you as you could be if you used all of your talents and gifts and potential and strengths. And when a person lives up to their fullest potential, they repeat their name to indicate you accomplished as much as you could in this world. And every person is different, of course. So Noach may not have been an Abraham, but he was lived up to be the perfect Noach, and Abraham the perfect Abraham, etc. Well, the Mishkan, also here, the word is repeated 2 in a row, Mishkan, Mishkan, to say that the Mishkan really had the ultimate type of holiness. And therefore, it was never destroyed. It was never disgraced like the Batei Mikdash were, right? It wasn't conquered. And it moved on in time. Eventually, we built the Batei Mikdash. The Mishkan, and I wrote about this last week in the Parsha sheet, the Mishkan, which was put up on the first day of Nisan, 3,333 years ago. And we used the Mishkan for 500 years. And it accompanied the Jews in the wilderness. They came to Canaan. It was still viable then. It was in Gilgal. It was 369 years in Shiloh. There's still a model of the Mishkan in Shiloh. It was in Nov, it was in Giv'on, etc. And then the Mishkan kind of faded away when we built the Beit HaMikdash. But in a sense, the holiness of the Mishkan never ended. And thus, the word Mishkan is a little different from the word Mikdash. Mikdash means holy, but Mishkan connects to the word Shekhinah, indicating that God's presence rested here. And that can never disappear. God's presence is eternal. The Beit HaMikdash may be gone, even though the place is holy, but God's Shekhinah, that never disappears. It always is with us in one form or another. So the Mishkan, or the Beit HaMikdash later, becomes the place where Hashem connects to the world, because it's a kind of touchstone that even though God is everywhere, there has to be a point where God specifically connects with the world. And that place was the Mishkan, and later on was the Beit HaMikdash. So we constantly pray for the return of the Beit HaMikdash, right? When we give a shiur, for example, it's customary to end the shiur by saying, She'ibana Beit HaMikdash Meher V'Yameinu, we should rebuild the third and final Beit HaMikdash. And the reason why that's so important is having a place like the Mishkan or the Beit HaMikdash, it energizes us, it strengthens us, and without it, we're weakened and we're fragmented. But with it, we are empowered, because it has its own special presence that is a force which basically brings everyone to Israel to be around it. It's kind of a magnet. It's a literal center around which all Jews will live. So the idea of rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash is something that will not only bring God closer to us, because in a sense, God will come home and there'll be a place we can go to where God's presence is strongest, but it is also kind of a rallying cry to everyone, come to the place where the Beit HaMikdash is. This is our spiritual center, and that will energize Jews all over the world to come back to Israel, those who are not already here, because then it will be very clear that this is our place, because God is here. If God is here, we want to be here. And so the Beit HaMikdash kind of sends the message, God has come home, God is here, join him. This is why in the Megillah, when Esther appeals twice to Melech Achashverosh, she asks him, she wants him to come to the party, you know, the whole story. So Achashverosh says to Esther, when she says, I have a request of you, he says, whatever it is, Esther, I'm willing to give it to you. Ad chatzia malchut v'yinaten lach. Up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. Now, what does this mean? Esther's not asking for 51% of the kingdom of Parasu Madai, but the Gemara in Megillah, Daf Yud Gimel, says that this expression, Ad Chatzia Malchut, means you can have anything you want except that which is going to impact negatively on my kingdom, specifically the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. And so he already anticipates that this might be something she would. Now, he doesn't know at that point that she's Jewish, but this is on his mind. Remember at the beginning of the story, he dresses, according to the Chazal, he dresses in the clothes of the Kohen Gadol to celebrate the fact that, at least in his calculation, 70 years has come and gone since the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. There was a prophecy it would be rebuilt within 7 or at the end of 70 years. His calculation was not correct. And so he thought the 70 years was up and was, in a sense, celebrating, oh, the Jews are not rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash. And that made him very happy because he understood that that is the heart of our nation, is to have the Beit HaMikdash. And once we didn't have it, then he can rest assured his kingdom will not in any ways be threatened, right? Of course, we know that the end of the story is that he miscalculates the years. It is his son, the son that he has with Esther, Darius II, who will give the order for the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. But he says to Esther, you can have anything but that, because that's going to be a rival to my kingdom. In a sense, it's like a chetz, chatzia malchut, and the word chetz can mean an arrow. In other words, it's like an arrow in my kingdom that, I won't be able to survive. To have a Beit HaMikdash, it brings a special honor to Hashem and to us as well. So when we reach the end of this parsha, you see that in the very last pasuk, it twice uses this word. It says, Uchvod Hashem alei Mishkan, the glory of God filled the Mishkan, and then Ki shachan alav ha'anan uchvod Hashem milei Mishkan. So there's certain honor it brings. This is our capital, that every nation needs a capital. And it signifies that we're a sovereign nation with a spiritual capital. And that's why in any discussion of issues revolving Israel and our neighbors, it's always Yerushalayim that is the central problem that has to be solved. And it's always the flashpoint of whenever there's any kind of uptick in the relationship we have with the Palestinians or with other nations. It always revolves around Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim is the most sensitive issue, as it signifies our control and our nationhood. And that's what Yerushalayim is, and that's what the Beit HaMikdash is. I remember that, there was once a very ill-fated idea of, in the peace talks with the Arab countries, especially with the Palestinians, and they said, let's talk about all the other issues that we can solve and leave Yerushalayim for last, because that's the toughest nut to crack. And I remember I wrote an article, I said, that's completely foolish, because it's like a person who comes in and wants to get a new job and he's being interviewed, and the only thing they won't tell him is the salary. They'll tell him about the benefits, where your office will be located, can you use the executive bathroom? But he keeps asking, well, what about my salary? And they say, oh, well, never mind about the salary. But that's the issue. That's what you really want to know. That's the central thing that concerns you. And that's true about Yerushalayim. If you can solve Yerushalayim, then you can solve all the other issues, because they're petty compared to it. But you can't really solve Yerushalayim, because unless they're willing to accept our nationhood, then and that is symbolized by Yerushalayim, then you'll never solve anything else. So the Beit HaMikdash incorporates not only holiness, but also the Mishkan that says God is close, God is imminent, and indicates that Israel is the one and only home for the Jewish people. So I suggest that while people pay lip service to the Beit HaMikdash, in truth, they may not actually be in such a hurry to see it happen, right? Do we really want the Beit HaMikdash to be rebuilt? In theory, yes. But in truth and in practice, maybe not. Because number one, people might lose their positions of power outside of Israel. This is the problem we discussed with the Meraglim. They didn't want to give up their positions of power in the desert. But not only that, once the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, then there will be this tremendous pressure on every Jew to come home and to leave Galut and live in Israel. And not everybody is ready to do that. And so I wanted to address just for a couple of minutes, because the other issue that obviously is captivated the news is what's going on in the Ukraine. And Elaine Schreiber, who's here with us on the Zoom, she asked this question to me, and I think it's really the central question that we should be asking, which is twofold. Should we be helping the Jews of Ukraine who are in a desperate situation now? And secondly, should we ultimately build up and support and increase the Jewish community of Ukraine? Well, we have a long and very tragic history vis-a-vis Ukraine. It has obviously not been very friendly to the Jewish people for a long, long time. We saw this obviously most dramatically during the Shoah, when the Ukrainians were very, very avid collaborators and supporters of the Nazis. Nothing illustrates this more than what happened at Babi Yar. Babi Yar, which it's still not clear if it was bombed by the Russians or wasn't bombed by the Russians, but Babi Yar is a place that stands out in some ways, along with Auschwitz, as the prime examples of the brutality and barbarism of our enemies. There, 35,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days. And most of those murders were perpetrated by the Ukrainians. The Nazis were essentially giving the orders, but it was the Ukrainians that went well beyond what the Nazis wanted to have done. Ad kedei kach that the Nazis even stopped the Ukrainians and said, we have a more systematic way of killing Jews, not just killing every single Jew you see at every moment, which is what the Ukrainians did. So even today, there's a tremendous element of neo-Nazism within the Ukrainian government, within the Ukrainian populace. And so it's really a very mixed emotions. Obviously, we're not supporting, I don't think, what Putin has done, which is really naked aggression, very naked aggression. But at the same time, it's very difficult to warm up to the Ukraine. Now, I think we can all agree that no matter what we think about the Ukrainians, we have a moral commitment, a moral obligation to save people's lives, not only Jews, but especially Jews. And so, we have to do what we can to help these people and save their lives or make their lives, less punishing. But at the same time, I think we in the back of our mind, we have a right to say, we've been urging Jews to come to Israel for a long, long time. And we have opened the doors, and we've done, I think, tremendous Herculean effort to provide for people coming here, people who maybe can't make a living, people who are elderly, people who are ill. We've opened the doors for those people to come. And then those people who don't want to come, we've told them that here you'll be safe and we will protect you. We have a fantastic army. We have a country that is not anti-Semitic. I'm not going to go there, but generally speaking, a Jewish country is not by definition anti-Semitic. And not everybody comes to Israel. right? But nevertheless, we don't want to be cynical to the point where we say, you made your bed, now sleep in it. We have to help them, even at the same time saying, we wish you would have come when you had the opportunity. And, from a spiritual point of view, the Gemara tells us that every diaspora community will at some point be dismantled and will have to come to Israel. So that might be in a benevolent fashion, or it might be in a very tragic fashion, but it will happen. And that's why I say that even while we have to help these people, at the same time, we also have to send the message that this is the homeland of the Jewish people. And this is the community that we want to build up. We don't want to recreate Jewish life in Poland. We don't want to energize Jewish life in Eastern Europe. We want people to come here. And if they're living there, then we may have a moral obligation to see that their basic needs are fulfilled. They have food to eat, they have shelter, they have safety. But do we want to promote the growth of these communities, especially in places where the local populace did everything it could when it had the chance to wipe out the Jews who were living among them? I was particularly disturbed by a statement that was made by the Jewish president of the Ukraine, and Zelensky, who, again, born Jewish, how Jewish, quote unquote, he may be is another story. He's married to a non-Jew, and his children are not Jewish. And there's other things that have been said about him without going into, I don't want to, justify any rumors about him, but he did make a statement, interestingly, that he was talking about what before the Russians invaded, about what he wanted to do vis-a-vis Jewish sites in the Ukraine. And one of them, he said, is in Uman. Now, Uman, which obviously is the birthplace of Rab Nachman of Breslov, and that's where he lived. So Zelensky said, I would very much like to somehow upgrade the infrastructure in Uman and create a whole Jewish complex there surrounding the synagogue that Rav Nachman prayed in. And I'm planning to call it Little Jerusalem. Now, this phrase, Little Jerusalem, it definitely struck a certain chord within me. And I want to just read to you, because here I think we're crossing a line. You can mark a historical place in Jewish life. You can build, synagogues. You can try to create some kind of historical context to a place, but calling something Little Jerusalem on a personal level, and that definitely strikes a very negative chord. But I want to read you something. Try to pretty much close with this. There is on Tisha B'Av, we read among the Kinot, the 25th Kinah that we read talks about the destruction of the Jewish communities of the Rhineland, Worms, Speyer, Mainz, during the First Crusade in 1096. And this is 1,000 years after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. But I want to read you just something about this particular Kinah. So the destruction of the Jewish community here in the German Rhineland by the Crusaders was particularly brutal. And there is a number of Rabbanim who wrote about it. One is in a book called Seder HaDorot. And I want to just read what's written here. The author of the Sefer Me'irat Einayim explained why the Jewish community of Worms suffered far more persecution and pogroms than other congregations. That community was founded by Jewish exiles who made their way to Germany following the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. After 70 years of exile, many Jews returned from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael and to Yerushalayim, but none returned from these communities. The community in Yerushalayim wrote to the Kihlah in Worms, for example, and urged them to join the new settlement in Yerushalayim. But the complacent Jews of Worms dismissed this invitation out of hand. Instead, they responded, "You stay where you are in the great Jerusalem, Yerushalayim HaGadol, and we will continue to stay where we are in Yerushalayim HaKatan." This arrogant response was due to the prosperity and prestige the Jews of Worms enjoyed, or thought they enjoyed, in the eyes of the local non-Jews and their princes. The success of Worms, he writes, was its undoing. The prosperity of the Jew in exile is nothing more than a divine test to see whether it will cause the Jew to forget his homeland and his heritage. Worms in the Rhineland failed, and they suffered bitterly. In our own times, the vast majority of the German Kehillah failed because, as the Meshech Chochmah writes, they began to call Berlin the New Jerusalem. And indeed, they removed, in the original Reform prayer books, they removed all the references to Yerushalayim and to Eretz Yisrael, because in their opinion, they thought, we're not going anywhere. It can't get better than here in Germany and Berlin. So I think the point becomes very obvious that we have kind of mixed emotions. We want to help our fellow Jews. We should. We don't want to see innocent people get killed. On the other hand, we believe that the future, the arrow of the future, is pointing towards Yerushalayim and towards Israel. And that's where the Jews of the diaspora should be and should plan to be, if not now, then at some future time, hopefully the near future. And that's what we believe will save them from the tragic outcomes and the tragic destinies of these other countries spread throughout the world. So we end this Sefer of Shemot talking about the Mishkan, because it is, again, this kind of magnet that says it can only be built in Israel. You can't have a Mishkan outside of Israel. You can't have a Beit HaMikdash outside of Israel. It's there in order to signify in a very physical way, this is where the Jewish people belong. Yerushalayim is our physical capital. The Beit HaMikdash is our spiritual capital. And that's where we should be gravitating towards. So it is also the lesson ultimately of Purim, because the whole reason why the story of Purim is even included in Tanakh is because the end result of the story is that Esther and Achashverosh's son Darius will allow for the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore it gives us a special importance to the events that took place on Purim, to tell us that if you're living under foreign domination, whether it's Haman, whether it's Achashverosh, you're not safe. Come home to Israel, and that's where Hashem's presence will be strongest and will protect us. Amen. So I'm going to stop, and if anybody has a comment, you can unmute yourself. And I know some people wrote some chats, and basically, I think you're agreeing with what I was saying, so I don't have to repeat any of the chats. But if somebody wants to say anything, feel free to unmute yourself and make a comment. Yes.
Good.
Yes, Tal.
One is regarding the Parsha, and the other one regarding the Megillah. So about the parasha, I noticed a similarity between how they build the Mishkan and how they dress the Kohen. And it kind of sparks my interest if they're actually finishing this Sefer Shmot in regards to how we're supposed to be building ourselves, not just, of course, we are a vessel of God, so I'm sure that has something to do with it, but I would kind of like to hear your much, much more smarter opinion about it.
Okay, I hear the building of the Mishkan, there's a tremendous, there's a lot of deep significance in terms of the Mishkan. Some say, first of all, it's a model as to kind of a reproduction of how the world was created. So God created the world, and then the Jewish people create the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash and different elements. It's too long a story to get to now. Maybe next year, when we come back to the Mishkan, we can do that as a topic, how the Mishkan relates and connects to the creation of the world. What was your question on Purim?
In the Megillah, it says to Esther very clearly, the Jewish people will be saved, but you have a choice whether or not to save your own family. And I was wondering if you know the significance of her specific family.
Well, her family is Mordechai, but I think she was saying that she can protect, her immediate family because she has protexia with the king. The truth is that Achashverosh was essentially as much of an anti-Semite as was Haman. So I don't think that she would have been necessarily safe either. At some point, the love and attraction that he had for Esther may not have been enough to save her. So she might have been saved temporarily, but I don't know that she would have been saved forever had she allowed Haman to carry out his plots. Eventually, even having one Jew alive in the kingdom probably would have been too much for Haman to accept. And he would have played upon Achashverosh's hatred of Jews as well. It's only the fact that Achashverosh understood that Haman wanted to usurp him and stage a coup that caused him to kill Haman because he wanted to retain his position as king. Any other question or comment? Okay, so I wish everybody a Chodesh Tov. I think we will still be back at the same time next week, 6:30, and we'll begin at some point, if not next week, probably next week, to say more about the Purim story and some deeper insights into Megillat Esther.